Hey, you. Yes, you. See all these wonderful people right here? They are my Patreons. With the support I get from them, I can afford to do my passion as a career and bring you guys weekly videos. Want to join them? For just $1 a month, you can get videos 24 hours before anyone else. And for even higher tiers, you can get Polaroids, letters, and mystery boxes from me to you. And even fursuit parts, not to mention my eternal thanks. So what are you waiting for? Become a Patreon today via the link in the description. Thanks again, enjoy the video.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to this episode of The Fight or Cut, the show where I answer your most pressing questions about my most recent tutorial video. This week, it was my shaving tutorial. All the questions I'm going to be answering today were left by you guys down on the comment section, and we're just going to get straight on into it. Okay, so the first question comes from Fluff Animations, who asks, about the back of the head, do you just not do anything to it, you just let it be? This is my personal preference. I prefer to leave the back of the head unglued. I just find it gives the lycra in the head a bit more room to stretch, and it gives the wearer a little bit more wiggle room. Really great if they wear glasses. It's up to you. If you want to glue it, have foam completely covering the back of the head and glue it, that is 100% up to you, but I find it to be add a bit more heat, as well as just make it a bit more of a firm fit, and I prefer a loose fit, but again, that's just my personal preference. I do glue, however, on the back of the cheeks and on just a little bit on the back of the ears as well, but other than that, I tend to leave the back of the head mostly unglued because it's not going to be seen once I've attached the neck lining to the neck, which you will see next episode. This next question is from Shard the Dragon, who says, I've struggled to find a good chalk or pencil for marking my pieces. They get lost in translation and a bit from the difficulty marking and the lack of precision. What do you use? So I use chalk pens. They're like paint pens, but just chalk. So they've got that pump action thing. You got to like push it against the page to get it to go. I've got that on it, and they're pretty good. I use the Crayola ones. They look like this. This is what they look like. They're really good. I recommend it. And they ask if black Sharpies are safe to use when cutting fur. Yeah, black Sharpies are fine. It's the colored ones you got to look out for. They're the ones that will run and ruin your lovely fur. It's happened to me. And silver Sharpies are okay too because they don't have any color in them. I tend to use washable markers like the ones they use for kids. You give to kids that wash out of your clothes for tracing bodysuits, because when I put it through the wash, all the markings disappear. I just don't use them on heads because they stain glue, and then when you wash the head, sometimes that ink can leak out and it can be a bit difficult to get rid of it. Next question is from Corvid Kid. When I use my tape pattern to make the fur, the tape goes on and fits perfectly as it should. However, every time I sew the fur and stick it on, the fur doesn't fit. It's always a little bit too small, a little too big, at a weird angle, even though the pieces line up perfectly with the tape. Why is this, and what can I do? So there's a couple of questions I'd need to ask you. The first one is, are you leaving any seam allowance? If you're not leaving seam allowance, then your pieces are not going to fit properly. I'll explain why a bit later in the video, but make sure you're doing that first. The second question is, what kind of tape are you using? Some tapes, like the PVC tapes, can warp with heat and cold, so the pattern pieces can change shape as you go, and that can affect your fit. The third question I need to ask is, what kind of fur are you using? If it's on the cheaper side, does it stretch when you pull on it? If that's the case, then it can stretch slightly when you're cutting it and sewing it, and that can affect the fit on the head. My best recommendation is, once you've taped your pattern up, get your pattern pieces before you cut them off and draw lines between them. This is the line of the pattern that you've drawn, like around the muzzle or whatever. You draw lines going like this, like line, 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 around, connecting all of them. And then once you've cut the pattern out, you copy those little tally marks onto the pattern piece as well and use them for reassembly later. And that's how you can make doubly sure that it's gonna be where everything is. Other than that, just make sure you're sewing neatly and exactly on your seam line where you've traced it. So this one is from J Tigress, who asks, what are the best sewing machine settings to use for sewing thick fur and minky? I know it's going to vary on machine, but sometimes I have a problem where the thread bunches while sewing. So far, a zigzag stitch works best than a straight one. My recommendations when sewing fur through a sewing machine, there's several, and I've had a long battle with my sewing machine. There has been many days, many tears. Sometimes it has not been a fun time. My best recommendation is, what I use personally is I use my straight stitch on the longest stitch setting. My machine can struggle sometimes to pull fur through, as I'm sure most machines do, and when you put it on the longest stitch setting, it's more likely to make successful stitches with it whilst pulling it through, and they're probably going to end up being the normal stitch length anyway. So that's what I recommend. Zigzag stitches are fine, not really for doing head stuff because the seam that it leaves is a little bit too big for my liking, at least. Other tip, check your tension. If your thread's bunching, your tension is probably a bit off, and check if your machine is threaded correctly and that you're using the right needle. Other things, check your needle plate as well. So it's the bit of metal that sits on the machine where your needle stabs into, the big metal thing. Check for dints and stabs in that, because if you're getting those issues, you may have some dints in your needle plate that's actually catching your thread and shredding it, which can cause it to bunch. I've had it so many times, and we go through so many needle plates, it's ridiculous. Final tip is invest in a walking foot. They're about 80 bucks each, at least 80 Aussie dollars each. But they are awesome. So you know the little feed dogs on the bottom of your machine, there's spiky bits that kind of pull the fabric through like this? Well, the walking foot adds another one on top, so it pulls it through with double the intensity. That really is really helpful for sewing both minky and fur. Lizzie asks, what do you mean by brushing out a seam? So when you're making fursuits and using fake fur, the pile, which is this long fluffy stuff, can get sewn between the two pieces of fabric, and it means that you can see the seam. You can see where the two pieces meet. And we don't want that. We don't want that. So what we do is we brush it out. Like you can probably, I think you can even see a little bit where I haven't brushed it out on Sky's ear there, probably. That is why we brush out our seams, so we can't see where the seams have been met. It's the great thing about fur is that you can hide them. So it's a technique to get the fur out of that seam. Use a slicker brush, you just go over it, and then it makes the seam look invisible. That's why we brush it out. Luna asks, why do you use a mask when you shave fur? To protect my lungs, because inhaling lots of solid bits of plastic that are flying in the air, tiny bits of plastic, and you will inhale them, is really bad for your lungs. It can cause lung cancer, among other things, including, I think it's called groomer's lungs, where basically all of the tiny bits of plastic accumulate around your alveoli in your lungs. It basically means you can't breathe. It's really bad. And you know, so is lung cancer. Both very bad. As a professional full-time maker, it's a very big risk of mine. So I've got to protect myself because I don't really want to die of lung cancer. I don't know about you. So yeah, there you go. That's the reason. Carnival asks, is it okay to shave after sewing the fur together, or would it be too difficult after that point? The reason I pre-shave personally is one, because it's easier. It's so much easier to shave a piece of fur on a flat surface than on a curved one. So that's going to make your shaves look a lot cleaner to begin with. The second reason is when you have full length fur and you glue it on the head, it's really hard to tell where all the little seam bumps are, or if the fur isn't sitting right and it's like rolled or bunched. It's really hard to tell when the fur is really long. So we shave it short so that we can actually pick up on that and go, okay, this needs to be shifted, this needs to be shifted. It's not to say that it's not possible to do it after, like shave after you've, you know, completely furred it, no shaving, pre-shaving at all. That's perfectly possible, but for beginners, I definitely recommend doing a pre-shave. Really help you in the long run. And finally, we have Snow Silk Just, who asks, what is seam allowance? I never understood the word, and when someone says don't use seam allowance, I'm always really confused. Okay, so here is a pattern piece I've traced onto some foam to pretend this is fabric. So as you can see, I've traced around it, but I've cut slightly out from where I've traced it. That is our seam allowance. Now, the reason we have seam allowance is because the actual thing we want to keep on the outside, like, you know, be visible, is the stuff that's inside that. So when we sew it on our machine, for example, I would sew this finger shaped closed, we want to have a little bit of a gap so that we aren't sewing directly on the edge, because if we don't have any fabric on the outside, it's going to fray and it's going to fall apart, which is just generally not what we want. We don't like things falling apart. So it's for durability and it's for ease of sewing, really. It's mainly for machines, but when you're hand sewing, you don't really need it, just keep your stitches small. But yeah, I hope that answers your questions, and thank you guys so much for all the support on my latest tutorial videos. The next one will be out in a couple of days, so be sure to keep an eye out for that video and leave any questions you have about that specific part of the process in the comments on that video. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in a couple of days. Bye bye.